Welcome back, everyone. We're now on our lecture on photography and the art of film. Don't panic, you're not going to have to memorize all these dates, but I just wanted to give you a good outline of how this technology evolves. The idea of photography emerges from the use of a device known as the camera obscura, which literally means dark room or dark chamber. It has nothing to do with the dark room where you develop film. It in fact just means a box that light cannot get into except through one single opening, and it was discovered many centuries ago that in such a situation, if light passes through one opening in an otherwise totally light-tight box, an image will emerge on the opposite wall from the opening, upside down and backwards and a little blurry, but an image of what's outside will be created through that small opening. So people knew of the existence of this device, and it was likely used by artists to help them improve accuracy in drawing and in the use of perspective. We know that a multitude of painters owned and used simple camera obscura throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But it was always the issue of trying to create a technology that would allow you to preserve the image, to make it stay or to fix it. So what we want to know is the name of the first technique that allowed for an image to be captured, and that was the daguerreotype. It's named after its inventor, Louis-Jacques Daguerre. It was invented about at the same exact moment as a similar device by a British inventor. So the reason we call it a daguerreotype is because Daguerre got there first with the patent. But basically what happens is a camera obscura is built. A plate of metal coated with silver iodide is placed inside. The aperture of the camera obscura is opened. The exposure time would have to be fairly long for an image to actually record, but we would only be able to make the single image. You would not be able to reproduce the photograph. So it was a way of making a single permanent image through this visual technology. So we sometimes call the daguerreotype tin types because they were very often made on sheets of tin that were coated with silver iodide. We know that the exposure time was really, really long, so people had to stay absolutely still if they were having their portrait, which meant that some daguerreotype studios, portrait studios, would actually employ the use of simple clamps and other devices to hold people's heads in place so that the figure wouldn't blur in the image. So the first daguerreotype studio, portrait studio in the US was opened by Matthew Brady, and both Brady and other photographers, including Timothy O'Sullivan, were employed to help record the American Civil War using the next big breakthrough in photographic technology, which is the wet plate technique. Same type of camera essentially, but instead of a coat of silver iodide on a piece of metal, the silver iodide would be coated onto a sheet of glass, and so the image would then be created in a sheet of glass, which would act as a negative, and so prints could be made from that negative, which would allow you to make multiple copies. So our first big technique is the daguerreotype. Owner of the first US photo studio is Matthew Brady. The first war recorded with the camera is the American Civil War, and that was recorded with the wet plate technology. We also want to be aware of the inventor of the next big breakthrough, the celluloid negative. And the celluloid negative was developed by the American inventor George Eastman in 1883. So that introduction of film on a roll, which you may have with if you've ever worked in a darkroom, was a really big advance in the technology of the camera. Of course, today we have the digital technology. Here's a diagram of a camera obscura, and there is the effect being presented for you. This is something you could do in a room that otherwise no light can get into if you covered one window in a small, otherwise dark room with a black, thick trash bag and put a small hole in the bag. You would have the same effect there, projected upside down, a little blurry, a little reversed from what you're used to seeing, but you would have a fixed image. The daguerreotype itself, again, is essentially that same technology as a box with a lens, and the image would be made on a specially coated piece of metal. So if you had access to these materials, you could in fact develop your own film. And in fact, when the daguerreotype was first made available, people actually developed the images themselves. They created darkrooms in their own homes to create these images. Here's one of the very first daguerreotype portraits. This is John Quincy Adams, who famously said of the image that it was too true to the original. He didn't really like how aged and kind of angry he looks. You can imagine, of course, that if you are forced to sit completely still so that your image doesn't blur, it would be unnatural to hold a smile for as long as it would take for the daguerreotype image to fix in the camera. You can see the hands are kind of blurred, so you get the feeling that he probably moved a bit in his hands as well. So exposure time could be 15 minutes. So you really see a lot of more stern expressions in old daguerreotypes because people's faces, of course, would tire if you were trying to smile that entire time. The wet plate technology of the glass negative replaces the daguerreotype, and so here you see a contemporary artist using that old technology to make a negative on a plate of glass that could be then printed onto photo paper. And of course, because we had these fragile glass plates, even though it sped up the exposure time, it still made it impossible for people to take photographs of things in motion. So most of the photographs we have of the Civil War are of the dead on the battlefield after the fact, since even the wet plate camera couldn't capture images in action. We know that the photographers of the Civil War also put their darkrooms along with them, and that is what you're seeing here is a darkroom on wheels, an image after the war, but still the same type of concept. Literally, the image on the glass plate had to be treated with chemicals as soon as the image was taken in order to be able to print from it. So the photographers of the Civil War had to cart their equipment around with them. This is a pretty remarkable example, one of my favorite photos from the Civil War, because it shows not only the humanity of the soldiers, but it also shows the limits of the technology. You can see most of the figures are in pretty clear detail, but some of them are almost transparent because they're moving. It also makes the moving water in the river almost appear like a smooth, soft pane of glass, because of course anything in motion would blur in these images. We can certainly see the evolution of the use of the camera for a variety of purposes other than just photojournalistic recording of history. Ansel Adams, of course, famously used the camera to record beautiful images of nature, both in what become public parks and in other forms. These are examples from Yosemite and Yellowstone. Certainly the photograph, though, primarily in the beginning of the use of the technologies, was used for the purpose of photojournalism, recording actual events. That's not to say that a photographer couldn't have an artistic eye, but this is a good example of an artist, Lewis Hine, who clearly was able to compose a beautiful photograph, but wasn't making the photograph for the purpose of making art. The artistic aspect, in a sense, is almost a side effect. This is another example of a piece that really is artistically beautiful, but more the purpose of its original purpose is to record history. This is the work of Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange was employed during the Great Depression by one of the government alphabet agencies, so-called. The FSA, or Farm Securities Administration, hired photographers to document the Dust Bowl and the migration of people who had lost their homes and their farms, trying to move to the to the West Coast, trying to find more opportunities to work as migrant fruit pickers or on other jobs, and then finding that there were no jobs when they got there. The image that you see here is, of course, very iconic. It is the migrant mother. She is one of the people who's lost her home and is on this treacherous journey. But the reason I think that the image resonates with us is you can see her emotional pain, and you see the children kind of turned away from her. They can't see directly the emotional expression she's making. But look at the images by the same photographer from other shoots in other moments in that same photo shoot, she happened upon them on the side of the road. And in fact, common-law husband of the woman in the painting and her oldest son have left them there at the side of the road while they go searching for help for either money or fuel to get the car back on the road. But you can see that the image on the left does make it look that they're in a grim situation, but they clearly have some shelter, they have some possessions, and the children are even smiling, which I suppose you do when you're having your portrait made. The image at the right, though, conveys the emotional urgency of the situation. So you still, I think, need a good artist's eye to be able to make an evocative photograph. But it does give you a sense that just snapping a shot with a camera, anyone can push a button, but it takes a really gifted artist to be able to find the right moment and the right composition to really tell a story accurately. We also see the work of photojournalism here with images from the career of Margaret Burke-White. She was one of the few photographers and the only female photographer to be embedded with the troops, American troops serving in the Second World War, and she even was present when one of Hitler's death camps, Buchenwald, was liberated in 1945. So the next image is hard to look at, but it does show you what she saw and the horrors that were allowed to happen under this totalitarian regime. You see in the lower right corner a picture of her taking pictures to document this horrific event. What you're seeing is actually the citizens of the town of Buchenwald being made by the American GIs to walk through the camp and see what they had allowed to happen. So the use of photojournalism could lead to social change. On a much less emotionally torturous note, we have the use of photojournalism really to sell things, and we see that here in editorial or fashion commercial photography. These are obviously images that are meant to kind of draw our attention to celebrity, to buying and selling of good entertainment. You certainly see that in the work of Annie Leibovitz and the work of Herb Ritts. Photography has long been associated with entertainment, and we see that here in the use of the stereopticon. The stereopticon is kind of like a Viewmaster toy. It is two photographs taken from just a few centimeters apart that are put on a sliding track that can be moved further or closer to the viewer's eyes when viewing through the viewer. And as you get it into the right position, it replicates the experience that you have with your natural vision. Your eyes, of course, are a few centimeters apart. So you are accustomed to seeing two separate points of view simultaneously to create the illusion of three-dimensional depth, and that's exactly what this tool does. If you look closely, you can tell that the photographs are just slightly different. If you look at this figure sort of in silhouette on the left-hand edge, you can see the head and shoulder and most of the torso. Here, the image is just slightly to the right, so we don't see the head or the shoulder, we just see a bit of the body. So you can imagine if you saw those two images at the right distance from your own eyes, it would create the illusion of three-dimensional depth. We also see artists using the camera to begin to solve the idea of capturing motion. So Edward Muybridge was well known for his photographs taken in sequence to show what happens to the muscles, in this case of an animal, but also of people as things are in motion. And so artists use these photographs to help increase the realism in their depictions of bodies in action. But we also can see that this looks a lot like a film strip, like a series of images one after the other, that if we saw them rapidly, as in a flip book or in an animation form, would create the illusion of movement. And so this is really the precursor to the movies. Muybridge, in fact, invented the zoopraxiscope, which is a device for viewing sequential images that are slightly different one from the other to create the illusion of movement. And that is the step right before the motion picture camera. We also see artists using the camera to make pure art, and that is certainly the case with Alfred Stieglitz. Stieglitz is an American artist who not only promoted the idea of the camera as an artist's tool and the art made with the camera as a viable art form in its own right. He published magazines that promoted this idea. He was also an inventor who figured out ways of using the camera effectively in low light situations, at night, in the fog, in the rain, and he published those findings. People could better utilize the technology. He also promoted the art of photography in his New York City gallery, Gallery 291, which was a reference to their street address. Gallery 291 promoted art photography as well as modern painting in the US. Probably his most famous image is the one at the left, known as the steerage, which literally separates the upper class passengers from the lower class passengers in a very visible, palpable, emotional way. He was eventually married to Georgia O'Keeffe. He was married to his first wife when they met, and he was much older than Georgia O'Keeffe. But you can see here his kind of passion for her and his expression of her power as an artist through images that focus very much on her hands. Artists associated with Stieglitz include Edward Weston, who used the camera in close-up to create images that almost read as pure abstractions, but actually are, of course, photographs of real things in the real world, a nude human figure on the left and a cross-section of an artichoke on the right. Imogen Cunningham was a female photographer in that same group, and there is her portrait of Alfred Stieglitz posing with one of his wife's paintings, a Georgia O'Keeffe painting, in 1934. A very important moment, really, in the history of photography as an art form is the work of Edward Steichen. He became the first curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and he actually curated an exhibition called The Family of Man, and that exhibition premiered in 1955. It was a collection of 503 photographs that were taken by photographers all over the world, and it showed really aspects of what it is to be human in work, in play, eating, family scenes, work scenes, all over the world. And it really helped to kind of break down the idea that we are very different because of being from different nationalities or having different skin colors. In fact, the show was so successful that it went on tour for 8 years, traveling to 37 separate countries. So really, you could look at this as an artistic precursor to some of the civil rights actions of the 1960s and later. You can certainly see that what Steichen later was doing was really showing that what makes us the same is far more powerful than the slight differences between us. We can also see photography being used to create illusions. In this case, it could be used in the service of surrealism. It's a perfect tool for surrealism because, of course, part of the surrealist idea is to make things look absolutely believable, but to trick your eye into seeing something that you couldn't see, like someone crying crystals as opposed to tears. We certainly see the use of the camera and motion picture when it comes to the career of Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali, of course, is the artist who painted the very famous melting clocks that you're well aware of. He also, though, had a career designing sequences for film. He worked with a Spanish director for the film Un Chien Andalou, which features a notorious scene, which is a special effect, but it does mimic the appearance of a razor blade being pulled across an eye. We also see that sensitivity of the eye and the danger of a wound to the eye in some of the nightmare sequences he designed for a 1945 film by Alfred Hitchcock. And you can see sequences from that dream being laid out for you at the bottom of your screen. That's the 1945 American film Spellbound. Definitely there are a number of artists using the camera to create fine art in the 20th and 21st centuries. This is the work of Diane Arbus, who's well known for photographing people who are somewhat on the fringes of society. On the left, you see two members of, or two residents in a retirement home who are being made to act the part of the king and queen of a prom at a senior citizens dance. You can see how especially the male figure seems to feel somewhat a lack of dignity in this scenario. You can certainly get a feeling of outsiderness from the scrawny child on the right who's playing war with a toy that looks very, very realistic. It's a very emotionally charged image for us today. Certainly you can see the work of Cindy Sherman as being fine art photography. What she became famous for were a series of images known as the untitled film stills, in which she herself, through different makeup and different costume and different settings, acted the part of sort of stereotypical feminine roles in movies. And so even though she's the same person in each image, she transforms your opinions about who she is and what she's doing. She goes from these kind of ingenue characters to this drunken socialite character, to the character of a farm widow who's put upon in a different way. Even though they seem to have these stereotypical associations, they are all her. So they're really kind of remarkable images. In later work, she started to replicate famous paintings. On the left is a painting of the god of wine, Bacchus, by the Baroque Italian painter Caravaggio, and that's her on the right using prosthetics to make herself into this young male god. It's kind of a remarkable achievement in film aesthetic. We've already talked about the controversy surrounding Robert Mapplethorpe, who used photography, of course, to document his life experience and his impending death from the AIDS epidemic. And we looked at the contrast of his work from the X and Y portfolio that brought balance between the more earthly and some would say ugly aspects of his life and the more beautiful, less sexualized images. Certainly we see a similar thing in the work of Sally Mann. Sally Mann became well known for images like this that at first glance seem to be children engaged in very adult activities. In fact, the photograph at the left of the girl smoking is actually her own daughter and her other children. She's holding a candy cigarette, so she's not actually smoking, but the pose and the expression on the bodies really show that children do imitate adults, and they play at the role of being adults, even though they're not maybe mature mentally and physically enough to take on those roles. It's a very jarring and intriguing image that makes you question, how aware are children of the adult world? How much do they already know about the difficulties of adult life? Certainly we can see art photography being used in a more lighthearted way in the work of William Wegman, who poses as Weimaraners in these kind of iconic and ironic poses, such as the dog looking at a bust of itself. Or here the work of Saxton Freeman, which is just fun. He uses very often food and other objects that are transformed in such a way to make them animated and appear to be engaged in comic activities. You certainly can see a surrealist bent in the work of Jerry Oldsman, who uses, before the days of Photoshop, used what we call multiple exposure, taking several negatives and printing them simultaneously into a single photographic paper allows him to create these illusions that are actually impossible, such as this tree popping out of an island that's floating above where it should be in the lake. This transmuted face into fists. So kind of an interesting use of photographic imagery, which our brains associate with reality in a way that is absolutely impossible. I definitely wanted to bring us, though, to some topics around the idea of the use of motion picture. So again, you don't have to know the dates, but we do have our first films being made around the year 1894. The name to know, though, for the test is the Lumiere brothers. They are the inventors of the first motion picture projection camera, and they opened the world's first commercial movie theater right around Christmas, 1895. And so their films are often very, very simple and very, very short, silent black and white films, but they were the first publicly shown pictures that had movement. One of their most famous ones was the arrival of a train at the station, which shows nothing more than a train pulling up and people getting off of a train. But when people first saw it, an image that can move, the the audience screamed and jumped out of the way, afraid that there was an actual train coming toward them. It seems kind of unbelievable by our standards today, but if you can remember the more contemporary 3D movies, I remember sitting in the theater seeing Avatar for the first time and literally trying to brush things out of my way as the camera moved through the jungle, and that three-dimensional illusion of things being in front of your face seemed very real to me at that moment. We had silent films for the longest time, 1895 to 1927. Film with sound did not become possible until 1927, and color film was not possible until the 1930s. The terms that you definitely already know just from watching movies and TV, but we want to be familiar with for the purpose of the test, have to do with the shots. A shot is an unbroken sequence film, and shots can be divided based on how much is revealed to us in the image. A full shot would be showing your actors head to toe. A medium shot would be half the body from the waist up. A close-up, of course, is the face. An extreme close-up is a portion thereof, like an eye or a mouth. We also have long shot, which is a shot from a very great distance. So you might not be able to detect your actors. You would see perhaps a long-range distant view of a building in the far distance. We also have panning shots and traveling shots, and that has to do with moving the camera. A panning shot would be one in which the camera pivots as on a tripod. A traveling shot would be the camera moving itself either on a track or on wires, or I suppose nowadays with drones. Obviously, editing is putting your shots together. We have the method of cross-cutting, which is rapidly going back and forth between two or more different points of view. Certainly know what a flashback is, you know how we do transitions from one shot to another with wipes and dissolves. You sometimes will see a match cut, which would be an image on the screen that fades and is replaced by a very visually similar image, like a moon that's then replaced by a close-up of an iris, of an eyeball. And jump cut is a very contemporary editing technique in which sections are removed so that you see isolated brief moments to speed up the action. We also have the term mise en scène, which has to do with what is captured on the scene, what is captured in the camera. And this is essentially what is controlled by the director in the camera as the film is being made. So a wider way of thinking about it is how the director can, through controlling the lighting, the set, the costume, the choice of actor, how can they convey information to us? We certainly feel a certain way about the character of Hannibal Lecter that's different from how we feel about the actor Anthony Hopkins based on the way the film is designed, the mise en scène. In Star Wars, for instance, you don't have to be told that Obi-Wan is a reliable, nice person based on the set of his home, and that Darth Vader is evil based on the set of the Death Star that he inhabits. You can tell a lot about the story by what is shown to you in the mise en scène. I just wanted you to be aware of some essential directors in American film history. Now, I'm not saying that they are all of equal importance or that you'll like all of their films necessarily, but these are arguably some of the most influential from the point of view of numbers of awards that they were nominated for and or won. From the 20s, really the director to be most familiar with is Charlie Chaplin, who was also the writer and star of his own silent, mostly comedic films. We then move in 30s with the rise of Technicolor, and the two films that we most associate with the use of that new technology of color would be Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz, both of which were nominated for Best Picture in 1939. From the 40s through the 50s, some of the major directors include Alfred Hitchcock, John Ford, Orson Welles. You certainly may recognize Alfred Hitchcock's style of the thriller in films like Rebecca and later Psycho, or Orson Welles' dramatic style of Citizen Kane. John Huston is one of the other top directors in the 1950s, well known for his dramatic storytelling, particularly the film that won the Best Actor award for the first time for Humphrey Bogart, The African Queen, which was made in 1951. Although, of course, cancel culture has removed him from our current list, the actor and director who was most nominated in the 70s is the director Woody Allen, whose films were nominated quite frequently for Best Picture, Best Screenplay, and very often for Lead Actress and Supporting Actress categories. But we could simply transition to the late 70s, early 80s as the rise of the blockbuster, with the directors, obviously, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. Spielberg is perhaps best known for his later films that are more dramatic, but certainly he made his career with the early blockbusters like Jaws.